You become much more attuned to the place you're walking through in a way that you never do if you're simply just driving through it or sitting in a house there. You notice the geology, you notice the change as you walk from one kind of geology to another and how that impacts the landscape, the plants, the people, the things that are happening there, the building materials, everything changes. So you really get the connection with the earth in a way that you can't really find any other way, I think. And to me, that really underlies everything that I maybe do elsewhere around earth care, in the sense that I think it has to come from that direct personal encounter, that knowledge, which is the only way that you can experience love for something, really. You can't do that in a generic, generalized way. You have to literally be there and touch it and feel it and know it.
Welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. In this episode, we'll talk with David Pott and Daniel Rutland, two friends from Durham in the UK. Both have wisdom to share from their experiences of pilgrimage, which we define as the practice of purposeful walking, guided by a particular goal or sacred destination. They explain how pilgrimage can help us to more deeply understand and love the earth, to open ourselves to a sense of God's presence in and through creation, and ultimately to become better earthkeepers. Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. Well, welcome, Daniel. Welcome, David, to the podcast. Thanks for taking time to share with us from your wisdom today. I wonder if you could orient our listeners by telling us a bit about yourselves, where you are, maybe something about your family and your work. And David, let's start with you.
Okay, so I was brought up in an army family, which meant that my dad, being in the army, travelled all over the place. So my childhood has got some memories of places like the Sudan and Italy and Germany, where he was stationed. But we had a home in Scotland, and about 7 years of my childhood were in Scotland, and that was very formative because it was a beautiful area. So, if you like, my interest in natural history began at an early age. And when I left school, I went to London and I started working amongst people with drug problems. And that was for about 10 years. That was the first part of my working life, was working as a detached youth worker and then in a drug rehabilitation project. Second phase of my life was teaching for many years. I was a teacher of religious education for a number of years, then head teacher of a couple of independent schools. And then the third phase of my working life has been about reconciliation and pilgrimage, sometimes combining those two major themes of reconciliation and pilgrimage. I live in County Durham now, so that's in the northeast of England. And of my family, I'm married to Pam, and we have 3 grown-up children, 9 grandchildren, 2 great-grandsons. So, quite a tribe.
Daniel, what about you?
Yes, hello, Forrest and everybody. I live very close to David, actually, which is probably partly why I'm here. I live in a place called Bishop Auckland, which is in the northeast of England, and have lived here only about 5 years, actually. Moved up from London, and David and Pam being up here was one of the factors that brought me up here, I think. I also married fairly recently, only 5 years ago, to my wife Heather, who's from Canada, and I guess we wanted to start somewhere new together, so here we are. I'm a support worker by trade. That's what I do for a living. I do that part-time, and I have various other community-type involvements the rest of the time.
David, it's my hope that today you can help our global podcast community to understand what is the practice of pilgrimage, and ultimately, how does it connect to the prospect of becoming better earthkeepers. But let's start maybe with a definition of the term. what is pilgrimage? And maybe how has the practice of pilgrimage been integral to some faith traditions?
Yeah, I looked up sort of definitions, and that was quite interesting. But then I thought I had a letter at the beginning of this week from a young man, and I thought his letter actually helped to define pilgrimage quite well. This is how it goes. My name is Jack, and I'm 28 years old. I have had many hardships throughout my life and suffer from PTSD. I have decided to go on a pilgrimage from Guildford, Surrey, and I want to walk to Lindisfarne, Holy Island, to come to terms with my past, boost my faith, lift my spirit, and become at one with myself. I feel the want and need to do this pilgrimage. And as I thought about that brief email to me and asking for my advice, which I've been giving him during the week, I thought that is actually includes, when I think about the definition of pilgrimage, it includes pretty much everything there in those few sentences, because I'd say that it's often, not always, a long journey, but quite often it's a long journey, especially the kind of pilgrimage he was thinking about. And it's to a sacred destination. Some pilgrimage routes, of course, are from a sacred destination to another sacred destination, often picking up other sacred places on the way. But actually he's doing something which is quite special, because he's going from his home to a sacred site, which is also a rather special type of pilgrimage when you just set out from your own home. And it's got an intentionality about it. So if there's some great long-distance walking routes, Cotswold Way, Pennine Way, etc. But when I walk on those routes, it's not the same as going on a pilgrimage. There's something of intention about it. And of course, in the medieval times, it was often about healing. So you would go to wells on the way, which are, healing powers or whatever. And he's looking for healing, of course, having had this suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And so he's seeking healing and transformation. So I think those few sentences from him very much define what pilgrimage is about, actually. Yeah. Yeah, when you ask about other faith traditions, it's quite interesting that there are some similarities, but some differences with the different faith traditions. When you think about Hinduism, I would say that when we think about Hindu pilgrimage, it's very often associated with sacred places, especially on the Ganges. So, the images you get are of millions of people in the waters of the Ganges. So washing and cleansing seems to be very much a central theme in terms of Hindu pilgrimage. And most people nowadays, of course, travel by public transport. There is a pilgrimage route at Varanasi, which is about 50 miles. But, not generally, it doesn't involve a huge amount of long-distance walking. And then the other one, main one, which happens every 3 years, is the Kumbh Mela. And they have up to 70 million people who go there for that pilgrimage, so huge numbers. Buddhism, you'd say, it's more in, as you'd expect from the Buddha himself, it's about seeking enlightenment. And the main place there is Bodh Gaya, which actually means place of enlightenment, the place of the Bodhi tree. Then when you think about Sikhism, the main place there is Amritsar. And again, I don't think they necessarily travel very far. Moving to Islam, of course, the Hajj, you'd say definitely pilgrimage is very integral and central for Islam, because it's one of the 5 pillars of Islam. And there is some walking between Mecca and Medina, of course, but again, most people fly or come in other ways to Mecca for the pilgrimage. And Judaism, of course, in the Old Testament, you read about the different festivals and how people went sometimes 3 times a year on those festivals up to Jerusalem. But because, of course, the Holy Land is not particularly large, again, those pilgrimages were, 3 or 4 days perhaps, not necessarily very long. And then with the destruction of Jerusalem, if you like, that tradition ceased. And so now in contemporary Judaism, it's really a case of going to Jerusalem to the Wailing Wall. And again, most people obviously travel and don't walk any great distance to the Wailing Wall.
It seems like you're placing a high valuation on the physical act of walking, I think, in terms of pilgrimage, at least when you describe the Christian tradition. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, I think so. I think it's quite interesting. Other religions obviously do place some value on walking, but I'd say that Christianity, and this has its roots in Judaism, because, of course, Christianity compared, say, especially with the other holy books, includes a lot of storytelling, and the stories around the Old Testament are often centered on journeys, of course, Abraham's journey and the Exodus, and, coming back from Babylon. And these different journeys are critical in the Old Testament, so that there's that, there wouldn't be any salvation history, if you like, without somebody taking a step in the right direction, out of Egypt or wherever. And then Jesus comes, and of course, he's a great walking teacher. He's a rabbi who walks and teaches, and, there's all the journeys there, and then there's more journeying with the missionary journeys, etc. So I think there's that sort of element of journey and walking in particular, which is very strong in Scripture, and so perhaps that's a reason why it took root more. Of course, it took root in particular from about the 4th century with Helen, who was the mother of Constantine and went to Jerusalem and Bethlehem and came back with relics, bits of the true cross and things like that. And that's, in a sense, when pilgrimage started to take off, and it became gradually increasingly popular during the Middle Ages. Of course, Jerusalem to start with, but then Rome and Santiago, St. Andrew's, Canterbury, of course, more and more after the Muslims captured Jerusalem, because that was no longer available to go on pilgrimage to. Yeah, and then, of course, the Reformation came and pilgrimage declined dramatically because the reformers associated pilgrimage with a lot of abuses. And then we've got the remarkable revival of pilgrimage sort of in the last 50 years or so.
So, Daniel, on this theme of walking, I know that you're a great advocate of walking, whether it's pilgrimage or not, but I'm wondering if you could talk about how pilgrimage and walking have become an integral part of your life.
Yeah. Well, I guess they have from an early age. My dad was a great walker and loved wilderness and often took us out walking. I also was part of a sort of a Christian youth movement thing when I was younger that involved quite a lot of going out for walks, including some very long ones that took a week or two. So that's become very much part of my life. I think meeting David actually has been part of it as well. We've known each other for a good long while, and I've actually joined in a few of his walks for some of the time, and just enjoyed walking with him too. And I guess I've also tended to just sort of organise my own pilgrimages, often solo things, and not necessarily the obvious routes. I haven't done the Camino or any of the sort of big obvious pilgrimages. I haven't been on any kind of organised pilgrimage really, other than those things I've done with David. But I found it pretty life-giving really just to sometimes take a pack and go off for a walk. And as David said, that's not going for a walk in itself isn't pilgrimage, but I think those things that have felt like pilgrimage to me have been when I've done that with a certain purpose or intention, I would say, and with this connection with land and location and maybe some of the history that goes with that. It's not always about the destination. I think, I started walking a lot in Northumberland, which is the county that's the most northerly in England, just north of here, really. And there was something special about that place that I picked up really before I understood any of its history with the Celtic saints. And I just loved to walk there, and I sensed that there was something important there. And that drew me, I guess. Since then, I've learnt more about St. Cuthbert and St. Aidan and sort of found several routes that led up to Holy Island and walked those as kind of pilgrimages. Yeah, and also David has been creating pilgrimage routes right in this area where I live. I've tried walking some of those as well, which are mostly centering on Durham, which has an ancient history of pilgrimage too. But I think what's been significant for me is often that these things have connected with life events in some way. So it's been often about kind of trying to find a way in life as well as on a route on land, if you see what I mean. I think, in fact, when I first moved up here, my wife and I, we walked one of David's new pilgrimage routes called the Way of Life, which actually passed through the town where I'm now living. And I know it goes right past David's door, actually. And that was part of our way of coming to this place and trying to understand what was here, trying to connect and trying to work out where we were going to live because we didn't really know. And yeah, so that was a kind of significant moment in life, I would say. And doing that walk in some way helped us to land here, really, and to feel connected to this place. I did one other, probably the most significant walk that I've probably done in recent times was actually at when I still lived in London, and I took a sabbatical from my kind of paid work and sort of gave myself this idea of being 40 days in the wilderness, which is obviously a theme from Scripture. And I took it in my mind to go off to the west coast of Wales, to St David's Head, and my thinking was to walk across the country to another sacred site on the other coast, but I wasn't really sure if I would manage to do that over 40 days. I just started walking east, really, and it just coincided actually with a big kind of crisis in my life, really. It was a moment of leaving one thing and moving on to another thing, really, and there was something very significant about that moment in time and trying to work it out by walking, really. And yeah, I think I was sort of moving. It is a paradox, but it was about moving on one level and it was about stillness on another. I think I was going through a lot of stuff emotionally and mentally, and somehow walking helped me to find an inner stillness, if that isn't too much of a contradiction, in which I could begin to explore some of these things, pray about them as I walked. Not so much verbal prayers, but just praying with my feet, really, and just beginning to kind of, as I think David said, he was talking about healing there and about the need many of us feel to kind of find resolution of things that we're struggling with or issues in our lives. And I think that was one of those moments for me.
Well, I really love the way that you're trying to explain that connection between action and stillness. Because you're right, it's a paradox. It's hard to describe. But I definitely can relate to that. I mean, there have been times in my life where I take retreats just to get clarity or pray about certain issues or questions, and never does my prayer happen just sitting around. Wherever I am, I have these particular routes in the mountains that I take to basically walk my prayers, or as you put it, pray with your feet. Really, really love that way of describing it.
This sort of reminds me of a phrase which is attributed to Augustine, which is solvitur ambulando, which means it's solved by walking. And I remember a similar experience to what Daniel was talking about. I think I was probably in my late 40s, and I was going through a period where I was feeling, rather depressed. And it got to the point where for the first time in my life, and the only time, in fact, I was prescribed antidepressants. But I decided that I wouldn't start straight away because I needed to go to Lichfield, about 30 miles away. And I thought, I'm going to walk there for this meeting that I've got in a couple of days' time. And so I walked across Cannock Chase, which is a beautiful area, and I stayed in a little retreat house, and it was just a very simple place. There was just a Bible in a very simple little bedroom. And then I walked the last 5 miles into Lichfield, and I just knew that I was completely okay and I never needed to take those antidepressants. So that was, if you like, a very striking instance for me of solvitur ambulando, pilgrimages, healing. I'd experienced it, so I could talk about it, on the strength of my own experience.
I'm very sure that people are going to be listening to both of your testimonies concerning really the impact and power of pilgrimage and of walking, and are going to be drawn to want to know more about that, how to actually go about doing that. But David, maybe you could talk about some of the ways that you've created pilgrimage experiences for others and the ways that you've taught people about the different purposes of pilgrimage practices and the different ways that pilgrimage can be done. What have you actually done in terms of making pilgrimages happen for other people who want to experience this dynamic?
Interestingly, I've just remembered that the first time I led a pilgrimage with other people, I think it was in about 1991, and I was running a teacher training course, just a small course for people who wanted to understand kind of different perspectives in education. And a lot of the course included having speakers come and a fairly traditional setup. But as I was thinking about the example of, especially of Jesus as a teacher, and I thought again about the walking Jesus, and I thought perhaps we should go on a pilgrimage. And so I decided, this was in London, so we went from Southwark to Canterbury, which of course is the route of Chaucer's famous Canterbury Tales. And so we went on this pilgrimage, and I planned some teaching, but I thought, as I went, there would be little times when I would teach various things. But I also wanted to leave plenty of time for just seeing what happened and learning from the environment as we walked through. And it was a remarkable time, and there were times when we tried to sort of imagine Jesus and us following Jesus and walking and picking up stories, and we'd see things which, in a sense, immediately made little parables, etc. And so it was a fascinating experience. And at the end of the course, I think all the students said that experience of learning on the hoof, outdoors, was transformative. It was more important than all the other lectures in the lecture room. So that was, if you like, my introduction to, organising a pilgrimage for people. And then later on, I organised or led a number of pilgrimages. I remember, for example, taking a group of students on a north-south journey in which we meditated on Christ's, it was roughly the same distance, on Christ's last journey from Galilee to Jerusalem, when he says he set his face to go to Jerusalem. Very much an opportunity for meditation as we walked. And then, as you mentioned, I have set up pilgrimage routes, and the first one was called the Two Saints Way, which is between the cathedral cities of Chester and Lichfield. So we knew there had been a medieval pilgrimage route there between those two cathedrals. And so I created this route, again linking up with one or two sacred sites that would have been on that pilgrimage route. And that opened in 2012, and I published a guidebook in 2015. And then I set up these Northern Saints trails, so that's 6 different pilgrimage routes. 4 of them lead to Durham, which curiously was probably the best-known pilgrimage site in the UK, which didn't have any pilgrimage routes to it. And then I created 2 extra routes, as it were, to improve the links between Durham and Lindisfarne. And the routes to Durham all begin with L. They're called the Way of Life, the Way of Love, the Way of Light, and the Way of Learning. And there are all specific reasons for that. The Way of Learning is associated with Bede, because it starts from Jarrow, and Bede was the great historian. Well, it's really the first history book about England that's known, the history of the English-speaking people. And the other routes, the names of the other routes, are really associated quite directly with St. Cuthbert for various reasons. And, of course, there are also Johannine themes, life, light and love. And St. Cuthbert had a great fondness for St. John's Gospel. So, yes, those routes have, of course, been used by many people, and many pilgrimages already actually have taken place along these routes. So that's a great encouragement. It's lovely if sometimes a couple of times I've stumbled on somebody who is using my guide, and that's very encouraging to know that people are being encouraged through walking the routes that I've been privileged to be involved with setting up.
Well, I'm appreciating the interplay, the sort of tacking back and forth between the historical purposes and even routes of pilgrimage and contemporary interpretations of that, or reinterpretations of pilgrimage, of assigning perhaps new purposes to pilgrimage that suit the present day. And in particular, I'm thinking about earth advocacy and earth care, which, of course, is an issue on so many people's minds, and for many, the cause of great despair. So I'm wondering, David, if you could talk a bit about how you have linked the practice of pilgrimage to earth-keeping, to earth advocacy, and what are the connections between those as you have helped people to form them?
In a way, my interest in the creation comes first. It was actually not until the 1990s that I more consciously took a great interest in pilgrimage and learned a huge amount and went to my first pilgrimage walks, etc., sort of in that conscious way. And so as I grew up, I had a great love for the outdoors and for birds in particular. I became a very keen ornithologist. I even remember the first time that I really saw a bird when I was seriously, if you like, was when I was about 22, and I wanted to know exactly what it was. It's quite interesting to know that sometimes people have always like a conversion about a particular aspect of creation. And I was also conscious, this was in the 60s, in fact, I began a column in a magazine called Buzz, and the editor gave it the rather pretentious title of "You Too Can Save the World." So, every month I wrote a little bit on ecological issues, and that was in the late 60s. So it was at a time when not many people were talking and thinking about that. And anyway, yes, I think that as I've got involved, especially with pilgrimage in the last 20 or 30 years, green pilgrimage and pilgrimage with a low carbon footprint, that's been very important to me. And so with setting up the new pilgrimage routes here, I've been keen to see if churches or individuals could open up their homes or their churches to pilgrims so that it's affordable for people and to increase, if you like, that low carbon footprint aspect. And I'm glad to say that quite a few churches have said, yes, people can come and camp here. Some people call it champing. And other places, the British Pilgrimage Trust have set up what they're calling sanctuary providers for people. So, yes, I think that there's a whole load of other things that could happen, but I believe that through pilgrimage routes, it is good for the environment. For example, the people who, if you like, look after bits of the pilgrimage stretches of maybe 5 or 6 miles, go and check as far as litter is concerned. So it's going to encourage a cleaner environment with litter picking and that kind of thing. I would also say that one of the things I was particularly encouraged recently I led something called the Lindisfarne Gospels Pilgrimage last year, and we had a lot of involvement with schools, and many of the schools, especially those, of course, near towns and cities, some of them, the children rarely get out into the countryside, and they particularly enjoyed that. And just the fact of getting children who are mostly inside or indoors on their games, and they're on computers, etc., was something special. So I was looking earlier today at a couple of comments, one from a teacher who said, "It was a beautiful day, and to see the children's smiling faces as they trekked across the field was lovely. Many children asked if they could go out and do this again." Another teacher, "They loved the experience of walking as a pilgrimage, observing the beauty of the landscape around them." So, yeah, these pilgrimage routes, I think, create all those kind of opportunities, really, and I think there's a whole lot more that could be done to make sure that pilgrimage routes are more consciously looking to develop, as it were, green pilgrimage as much as possible.
Daniel, you too are an advocate for earth care, and I'm wondering, in terms of how you've seen your commitments be shaped and inspired, how have you seen the connection between walking and pilgrimage to earth care?
Yeah, that's a good question. Walking is just, it's just something that comes so naturally to me, and I just find myself wanting to do it. And I think it shapes when you walk a lot, and especially when you're walking in creation, it shapes your attitudes, the way you think, the way you do things in ways that are probably quite unconscious, but it is interesting to think about them. I mean, there's so much you could say on this. I think one thing for me is that just going on a longer walk, and especially, going out into the wilderness in some way, and just to go out and to be away from so many of the things that we normally take for granted, roofs and showers and all those things. And I've done that quite intentionally recently, and really even just left the tent at home and just taken what I would call a bivvy bag, a sort of thing you can put a sleeping bag into, and literally sleeping on the ground, under trees, wherever you can find somewhere to sleep. And I've sort of explored things around foraging, collecting plants that one can eat, and you're really focused when you do that kind of walk. You're really focused on very basic things, on finding somewhere to sleep or finding something to eat, on your feet being on the ground, on the weather. I mean, that becomes incredibly significant. You notice so much, and you become much more attuned to the place you're walking through in a way that you never do if you're simply just driving through it or sitting in a house there. You notice the geology, you notice the change as you walk from one kind of geology to another and how that impacts the landscape, the plants, the people, the things that are happening there, the building materials, everything changes. So you really get the connection with the earth in a way that you can't really find any other way, I think. And to me, that really underlies everything that I maybe do elsewhere around earth care, in the sense that I think it has to come from that direct personal encounter, that knowledge, which is the only way that you can experience love for something, really. You can't do that in a generic, generalized way. You have to literally be there and touch it and feel it and know it. And we all do that in our own places. And then that translates into a sense that, well, all places are of great significance, even if we don't know them personally. And a sense of their sacredness, really, and wanting to protect them, wanting to honor those places, those landscapes, the plants, the animals, everything that grows there, that lives there. It just becomes very deeply embedded in my psyche and my understanding of God as well through that act of walking and pilgrimage, I think.
Well, both of you are describing a practice that's very embodied, that you're bringing things right down to the ground in terms of how you learn, how you experience, how you understand. It has everything to do with this very physical act of walking and intentional walking. It leads me to another question about something that I know both of you are engaged in, and that is meetings that have been happening regularly on Sundays that I think are meant to cultivate spiritual engagement with God and nature. You're not calling it church, but I want to hear more about this. And maybe, David, we can start with you. What are these meetings about? And, typically what might you do in one of these meetings that you're having on Sundays?
Yes, well, they're very much, if you like, creation-centered worship. So wanting to learn from the creation in different ways. So just to give you an example, typically we'll meet and somebody will prepare perhaps a sheet with a number of meditations and thoughts, and then we'll go out perhaps for 45 minutes or so individually on our own, thinking about the theme for what it is, then come back and share together. So, for example, I did one on roots, and so we met in a place where there are a lot of good exposed roots by a river, and I had a number of quotes, including some from the Bible about being rooted. And so it was an opportunity to actually go out and have a close look at roots, think about that, and then apply it to your own life and about aspects of rootedness, really getting hold of the metaphor, if you like, through a close engagement with creation. And as I say, we'd come back and share about whatever theme it was, and perhaps, close with one or two prayers. That's typically sort of what happens, perhaps about an hour and a half. And actually, we often have something to eat. Maybe we bring something with us and have a drink and a snack together. And that's always very fulfilling. In fact, that's, I think often we do the sharing at the same time as having our snack and our drink at the end. So that's typically what happens. But just to explain why we called it the gathering rather than church, I think it's quite interesting when you think about Jesus and the institution of the church, that the word that he would have been used to in terms of a building-centered approach, if you like, was synagogue. And when he spoke to and said about, I will build my church, he didn't use that word synagogue, which is rather a static concept. Instead, he used this word ekklesia. And the Greek word in ekklesia actually means a gathering of people or a called-out community. It certainly had no association whatever with a building in that word in the Greek language. It was often, in fact, it had no association with religion either. It was actually when people came together, often perhaps in a courtyard or a central square in the city, to gather and discuss matters, but perhaps make judgments or whatever. And so that's the original understanding of ekklesia, which, as I say, the accurate translation more would be assembling, an assembly. And so we just thought that if you just use the word church, whatever you say, people still picture a building, even if you're sort of saying to people, oh, the church is about the people rather than the building. But it's very difficult to get that concept through. So just one of the reasons why we chose to talk about it as the gathering or the outdoor gathering.
Well, Daniel, I'm curious about your take on the fact that, many people around the world are practicing what some are calling eco-spirituality or nature-based teaching or nature-based worship. And examples that come to mind are Forrest Church movement in the UK and the Wild Church movement in the US. My question for you is, why do you think people are drawn to such gatherings? What are they looking for? And perhaps what deep needs are they seeking to meet?
Yeah, there is a lot happening, certainly. And I guess I can't claim to have my finger on the pulse exactly, but I can only go really on what I've been experiencing myself and with this gathering that we've been doing and people that I've been talking to. I think, yeah, it's something very deep, and it's something that we don't necessarily always put words to. But I think a lot of people are searching for something that's, and I think the word is probably integrated, holistic, something that is not just about a spiritual realm somewhere or a set of kind of mental or sort of abstract dogmas, but it is something that's really deeply embedded in being in all its richness and fullness in our bodies, in the earth. And yeah, I think sometimes the problem is that churches have kind of lost this in many ways. We've ended up with a very binary kind of spirituality, which tends to separate matter from spirit rather. And I think a lot of people are just searching for some way to bring those things back together again. Even if they wouldn't put it in those words, I think that's a lot of what's going on, to try and reintegrate, and heal again, basically, these rifts that have happened somehow in us.
One thing that occurs to me on this is that there's sort of been a bit of obviously a big shift. We talk about the shift from modernism to postmodernism. And modernism was more concerned, I think, with reason and rationality and logic and so on. And the postmodern culture is much more sensate and to do with feeling. And so I think, people looking for a more embodied spirituality. So I think that's sort of part of what has happened. And in another, also, I think that you could say it's almost like a reaction to, in the context of climate change, perhaps we want to get out, we want to connect with creation while it's here. Let's get out as much as we possibly can because we don't know, exactly where we're headed for, and it's getting pretty serious. So why not get out and do things as well, care?
These movements that you both are describing are making me think a lot about my daughter's generation. She is 20 years old, and I have to say that so many of her peers, her friends, her schoolmates have in many ways walked away from church in its traditional format, where much of it involves a building, much of it involves abstraction and a sort of, logic-based teaching, as opposed to more embodied teaching. It does make me wonder if you think that this move toward engaging God in and through creation might also ultimately be an answer to the younger generation's current disenchantment.
Yeah, I hope so. I really hope so, because I don't know about the US, but in the UK, there's a really obvious lack of younger people in traditional churches, and that sounds as if it's similar in the US. And so, yeah, we have to find other ways to engage the next generation, and I really hope this is one way that will do.
Well, I think even more heartening is the fact that many young people are actually taking the lead on that, right? And they're sort of forming these different pathways, these different ways to encounter God and really form relationship with creation. David, did you want to add to that?
I think if you were to ask people, and I have done this often, ask people, where do you most easily connect with God? And they all, nearly just every person just about says out in the creation. And it's very rare for somebody to say, oh, in church or at some kind of worship session or something like that. It's just about every time the creation.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I hear the same thing when I ask that question. And, I think we ignore that reality at our peril. I'll say the church ignores it at its peril if it doesn't acknowledge that truth that people, for whatever reason, are encountering God in more real and experiential ways in nature than they are in church. This podcast has listeners really from all over the globe. And so while it's fascinating to hear how pilgrimage plays out in the UK, I'm wondering, probably some people are asking the question, is pilgrimage possible everywhere and for everyone? Or do we need to maybe live closer to these ancient pilgrimage routes? I mean, what's possible for the person in Australia or Costa Rica or Nepal in terms of pilgrimage?
Well, yes, I think you could have pilgrimage anywhere. And of course, the main thing is to connect perhaps with indigenous sites that are significant. And so certainly you'll find that in Australia, therefore, with the Aborigines. But so many places, mountains, rivers, wells, etc., have got that sense of the sacred about them in whatever country you are. Just in terms of a resource on this, there's a website called the World Pilgrimage Guide, and the website is called sacredsites.com. And it actually has, all the different parts of the world, and you can just click on the country and you'll find, something about pilgrimage there. I'm not sure quite how many countries are represented in each area of the world, but it is a lot. So that's a site that's well worth looking at.
Of course, as you pointed out earlier, pilgrimage may or may not involve sacred sites, depending on what your purpose is, what your intention is. So I think that opens up the whole world as well to the possibility of pilgrimage wherever you are. And, that site that you just mentioned, David, we'll definitely link to that in the show notes. Let me ask, if people are interested in learning more about how they might integrate pilgrimage into their lives, what other resources might you recommend? And Daniel, you can also add on to that list if you have something. But let me ask you, David, what resources do you recommend?
There's another website I'd recommend is britishpilgrimage.org. Now, I know, again, you say this, what about other places in the world, but I think it's a very useful site because there's sections of it that talk about preparing for a pilgrimage, how you go about it, etc. So that's a useful site. A book that I found helpful is called The Way Under Our Feet by a person called Graham Usher, published by SPCK. And there's one that I haven't actually read yet, but it looks to be pretty useful book, and it's called The Art of Pilgrimage by Phil Cousineau, Cousineau. So those are what occurs to me. I think there's a lack of... There's been a lot of, if you like, books about pilgrimage or people's experience, but I still think there's room for a lot more on resources for people on pilgrimage.
Daniel, have you found that there have been any particular resources that have helped you to understand pilgrimage?
That's an interesting question. I think, to be honest, part of me wants to say just go out there and do it. Put some boots on, put a rucksack on and walk, and you'll find things that matter. I would say that I have a sort of rhythm of prayer that I use, mostly from the Northumbria community, which I'm part of. And it is helpful to have some simple prayers that you can use as part of a pilgrimage or a walk of that kind. I tend to often take a little book of poems, which whatever speaks to me, or maybe just a very simple bit of scripture, maybe one gospel or something like that. Not too much. You don't want to be carrying loads of books around. I mean, really, you want to carry almost nothing around, but something with you that will just help you to reflect on what you're doing. And I think what I've often found is that as you walk with those things, as you maybe begin the day by just a simple prayer or reading a poem or a piece of scripture, you'll often find as you walk that day, you'll find all kinds of resonances with what you've been reading earlier or thinking about. And those things kind of knit together and begin to speak to you. Yeah, and beyond that, it's just being open to what's around you, really. I mean, the resource is creation. And, the more I go on in life, the more I think what we are walking through or what we're living in is the dwelling place of God, in a much richer way than any church building could be. And, if we walk in that spirit expecting to meet the divine within creation around us, any place can be sacred, to be honest. It really doesn't have to be a amazing piece of landscape or something with incredible history. As you go there and explore that place, you will begin to find its sacredness and its associations that are meaningful for you.
Yeah, I think that, walking with God is metaphorical in Scripture quite a lot, but it's also literal. I'm sure that Enoch, as it says, Enoch walked with God. I'm sure that it wasn't only, if you like, just a metaphorical, but that he actually did walk and encounter God day after day. And that's what I've found. I found that actually doing the literal thing, the literal walking with God, if you like, enables the rest of life to be marked more consistently in a spiritual way. Another thing, just that in terms of a resource idea, if you like, is if you're going on a pilgrimage for a few days, you could almost like say that it's almost like an encapsulation of your life. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I've led these kind of meditations with groups of people, but it can be done on your own. So your first day, as you set out, you think about things like your name, why you were given your name, any stories and circumstances around your birth, and just reflect on that. And then perhaps your second day, you're reflecting about your childhood, school experiences, etc. And you just, in a sense, go through life. And as you come to your destination, you think about how you want to conclude your life. What kind of aims do you have for however long your life is, So I think that can be quite a helpful way of, or form of meditation for a pilgrimage.
David, one of the struggles that listeners to this podcast experience often has to do with finding the balance between hope and realism when it comes to climate crisis and the future of the planet. And I know that you've given a lot of thought to that. You've written about it as well. I wonder if, in concluding here, I can ask you what perspective you might offer to those folks who are looking for the balance between hope and realism.
Well, the first thing I'd say is learn a lesson from history and be ready. And by that I mean that civilizations typically last between about 250 and 350 years. Various historians have looked at the history of civilizations, including Arnold Toynbee, and that's the sort of time that a lot of civilizations last. And Western industrial civilization is getting quite close to that time. And what typically happens is that civilizations grow, quite gradually grow and increase, and then they reach a sort of stage which some people describe as overshoot. So they're living, if you like, beyond their capacities, usually because of greed and that sort of thing. And then they fall quite rapidly. And so obviously we're beginning to feel, I think, that this one is rather different because the civilization is almost virtually global and it is threatening to be terminal. It's more and more people are realizing that we're not keeping within the bounds that were intended in terms of temperature rise, etc. And I have just a couple of quotes that interested me on this one. This is from Albert Einstein. All of our exalted progress, civilization for that matter, is comparable to an axe in the hand of a pathological criminal. And then Arnold Toynbee says, civilizations die from suicide, not by murder. And some people, of course, have coined the term ecocide, so that's what is possibly happening now, sadly. But the thing is that we need to take a long view of history, which is also what the Bible does. There's a lot of short-termism, of course, but, so we say, well, it's quite normal for civilizations to rise and then to collapse. And, of course, the Bible is very realistic about the collapse of civilizations. And when we read a book like Revelation, it sounds incredibly contemporary with everything about earthquakes and famines and so on. But in the context of that, the people of God are encouraged to live really well in the midst of all the tribulation and persecutions, etc. So I think we need to recognize that the purposes of God, if you like, unfold gradually through the ages with the rise and fall of civilizations. So that's the first thing, just in this sense, recognizing this is quite almost like normative. Although, yeah, with the whole thing about it possibly being terminal for the human race, I think we've got to, in a sense, say, could it be? Could that be what happens? I have hope that it isn't, that there is a way through, but I don't think it's going to be through the normal ideas of sort of technological, everything will happen through technological solutions. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that I hold on to the idea of the new heavens and the new earth. And I love the image in particular in the prophet Isaiah. It's in chapter 65. We get a tantalizing glimpse of the preferred future that we would love to see if humanity does survive the current crisis. And it includes a renewed garden city, good housing, food security, meaningful work, a hopeful future for children, and ecological harmony and reconciliation. And of course, that is also there very much in picked up that theme in the book of Revelation as well, about new heavens and new earth. So hold on to that hope. And then third thing I think is prepare for what I call a difficult labour. The passage in Romans 8, which talks about the whole creation groaning in travail. And I think that is how it is, that you kind of experience that, but the groaning, the labour, but actually you also have hope. You hold on to hope because something new is going to be born. A friend of mine said that, we need to educate when we're up doing this and just show and encourage the young generation to recognize that our current human system, which is based on mechanistic and anthropocentric ways of thinking, is completely misaligned with the planet's capacity to support life. So I think what we've got to say is this must be the end of Homo economicus, as people sometimes say, or Homo colossus. For our future needs, we need something very different, which is prioritizing the whole human development within the context of a highly interconnected, more than human living world, a living world that bends towards relationships of collaboration and mutual benefit and emergent novelty. So yes, at the moment I can identify with this sort of deep groaning that's spoken of in that passage in Romans, but it's not a groaning without hope. So you might say groaning with hope is how things should be. I agree that much that's going on in creation, but actually, sometimes I suddenly get a bit of blight, like I saw a flock of fieldfare, and I used to see very large flocks, and I hadn't seen many for a long time. Then, just recently I saw about 100 fieldfares, and I thought, oh, great, that's just so encouraging. Then we just have to hold on to those hopes that there will be a new heaven and a new earth. So I don't know how that's going to work out, but I think, I often used to think that, this world is going to be wrapped up completely and then somewhere else in outer space or somewhere there's a new heaven and a new earth. But I think that there's lots of indications from passage like Romans 8 that perhaps, no, there's something that could happen here in terms of a totally renewed world. And so that's what I'd be encouraging my grandchildren to look towards and to be hopeful and innovative and see if they can bring in something totally different to what we've got now.
We've been in conversation with David Pott and Daniel Rutland about the ancient and contemporary practices of pilgrimage. To learn more about David and Daniel and to access resources that help us to incorporate pilgrimage practice into our own lives wherever we are, go to the show notes for this podcast episode. I'm Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Our producer is Dave Wolfers. Forrest Reed is the creator of our original music, and Timothy Connor is our podcast editor. Our research assistant is Alex Megerly, and Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.